We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for your patience. We had two different times, one at 6 and one at 6:30, but our intentions was to start at 6:30. So we want to thank you for coming out. This is an important meeting, and we're here to have a discussion. We're not here to blame anyone, point any fingers at anyone, but we're simply here to have a discussion. This is a listening session, and so we thank you for coming out. We want to talk about Brooklyn. We want to talk about Second Ward, and we want to talk about the new proposed development, and just have a conversation around that. And so by the time we're done, we're hoping that you'll feel more enlightened about the project, and we can have, this will be the first step in many conversations going forward. Okay, so at this time, we're going to start our agenda, and we're going to ask the pastor of this house, Pastor Dr. Dwayne Walker, to come and give us a welcome and open us up in a word to God.
Please hold your applause. Please hold your applause. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the members and officers of Little Rock AME Zion Church, let me welcome you to our campus and to say how delighted we are to host this listening session on tonight. It is our hope that it would be inspiring, enlightening, empowering, that we would be something that would help us move our conversation forward in a very productive way that would be a blessing to all who are involved. Let me say welcome back home to those who grew up in this community, and to say to you that we're glad to still be a part of this community, and we join you in concern about the future of this area, and we don't plan to go anywhere, so we plan to continue to open up our doors and open up our hearts to all that God would allow us to be a part of as we move forward in this discussion. I think tonight's going to be a powerful night, and I hope and pray that we will leave here feeling that we have not wasted our time, but that we've been able to express our hearts about the matter, and that we will be able to implore others to take those who have been here, and let them know that we don't take their time for granted, and that we want to be sure that everyone continues to feel a part of the Charlotte community and the Charlotte story. So again, thank you for coming to Little Rock AME Zion Church. We welcome you here. I do want to say to you that if you are here, you don't have a church home, I would love to be your pastor. And Little Rock would love to be your church. Yes, right. And so you're welcome always to come here to worship with us. And anytime our doors are open, feel free to come in and take a seat and be a part of whatever we're doing. I would love to open up with prayer if that's appropriate. Let's do that. Eternal God, our Father, we do thank and praise you for every privilege that is ours to gather as your people, to come into this place, to share our story. We thank you, God, for persons whose shoulders on which we stand, for the legacy that they've bequeathed to us, and the passion in which they established this community. Now, God, we pray that as we discuss and deliberate tonight, that you will be glorified, and that all who will take part of this discussion will leave here feeling blessed and empowered. Thank you for those who have organized this event tonight. Please guide them with your wisdom and your power, we pray. We ask it all in the name of your Son and our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Amen. God bless you. Welcome.
Okay, part of why we're here tonight is to talk about how a black community was erased, and how now there's going to be a new development that's going to be built on that property. And so the question that we're having is, does this new development speak to the historical injustices that took place in Brooklyn and Second Ward. And so we're going to go a little background. In 1958, the Charlotte City Council voted to demolish the community of Brooklyn for the purpose of creating a better environment for its residents and attracting business opportunities to the city. Over a 10-year period, over 9,000 residents would be forced to move to the outskirts of the city as the history of Brooklyn was erased. And so you have to really think about what that looks like, to have 9,000 people moved out of a community in which they loved, and they really didn't have any voice in that decision. Between 1960 and 1967, Brooklyn was raised in 5 stages, and not a single new residential unit was built to replace the 1,480 demolished homes and ultimately 1,007 families, mostly to northern and western points of the city. Black businesses which relied on black communities to thrive were forced to close. And so we're talking about 216 closed businesses in Brooklyn, and many never reopened. And so, the question I've always asked myself is, what did that do to generational wealth here in Charlotte? When you talk about 216 businesses closed, we're talking about children being left businesses that they can then run. And so there was an economic impact that took place. When we're talking about black-owned doctors, dentist offices, we're at the Mecklenburg Investment County building. It was an office building for black professionals. Arthur Griffin, this is a quote that was in the newspaper. He grew up in a 3-bedroom shanty 3 blocks from the largest black neighborhood in Charlotte.
That's not 3 bedrooms.
No?
3 rooms.
3 room, I'm sorry. Excuse me, yeah. 3 room. My apologies. My glasses are a little foggy. A 3-room shanty, 3 blocks from the largest black neighborhood in Charlotte. And so his quote at the time, which I think is really telling, he says, it was the Ballantyne and Myers Park of Charlotte today. It was the soul of the black community. And so I think it's important that we intervene now in this new development that's being built, because if we're not careful, what you will build and what will be built is another Ballantyne, and it will be another South Park. And so these were some of the pictures. You guys are probably all familiar with them. And you see the pride, right? The sense of pride, and that pride comes from owning something, being owners and being professionals. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this was a picture that was taken from some of the teenagers that were students at Second Ward. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Look at the smile on their faces. Right? Now the Savoy, this was a black theater. Right? Now who could tell me what's been built there in this place? Huh? It's the Savoy Luxury Apartments. Savoy Luxury Apartments is where the Savoy Theater, historical theater, by the way. And so those are the things that you really have to factor in, because there was a whole community that was erased. We're not just talking about businesses. We're not just talking about churches, and we're going to talk about that, 11 churches. We're not just talking about 2 schools, one of them Second Ward, but we're talking about a community, a culture, movie theaters, libraries. Some of the most important libraries in all of North Carolina was in Brooklyn and Second Ward, hosting a lot of historical records about the contributions of African Americans, and they were destroyed. So now I want to talk a little bit about the scope of the injustice. This was a quote from Tom Hanch's book, Sorting Out the New South. It's a very powerful book, and I recommend you read it. It says, Second Ward, and you look at the word he used to describe Second Ward, a then thriving Second Ward, as populated by blacks, many owning comfortable homes, and he says, before prophetically asserting, far-sighted men believed eventually this section, because of its proximity to the center of the city, must sooner or later be utilized by the white population. Government-sponsored urban renewal eventually stole this valuable land from black charlatans. And I think that's the point that we really have to address and acknowledge. This wasn't done, and we're going to talk more about this, because of the blight and crime. This was an economic opportunity for some, and they did it at the expense of a whole African American community. And the point that what we're pointing out now is, if you build what's going to be $1 billion development on that property, how do you address the historical injustices that took place during that time? So these are the churches that were closed during that time. And, the church is the center of the community. And especially during this time, I mean, we're talking about at the height of the civil rights movement. I know in Montgomery, the Montgomery Improvement Association started and circulated through some of the black churches, what type of impact does it have, just to displace and destroy and bulldoze all of those churches during that times. And then not too long after that, they built First Baptist Church, which I believe is a white church. Am I right? Yeah. So they destroyed those churches and they built a white church, and that's okay. So now we're going to call Justin Perry at this time, and we asked him to talk about the trauma, and he's going to come in at this time. Thanks, brother.
Good evening. So, as Reverend Keaton was talking, one of the words that kept coming to mind was home. So we have a term that's a house, but we're actually talking about home. And for me, it's interesting, this actually was my church home growing up. I was baptized here 38 and some change years ago. And, even for me, growing up here, when I went to college, my parents actually switched churches, and I came home and didn't realize until a Sunday when we were going to a new church. And honestly, I felt uprooted, and I never truly dealt with that. And so to me, when we're talking about Brooklyn, as he mentioned, it's an economic opportunity for some, but again, this was an uprooting and a disconnecting for a lot of other folks. And so I think it's really important, and when we talk about the history of Charlotte, it's important to know that there has always been a message that some people matter here and some people don't. So when we talk about this connection, this attachment, we have folks who show up here still with the memories of Brooklyn, with the lifetime and the history of Brooklyn. We're talking about this concept of attachment, this concept of belonging, this concept of bonding. And so I think, to me, when we talk about trauma, I think it's really important to think about every average human being. We all have shared needs. What are some needs that we have as people? shelter, clothing, protection, security, love, peace. Tiffany, she's on a roll over here right now. So all of these things, these are not unique to any of us. We all have these shared needs, right? And so what I want to talk about is what it looks like when those needs are met versus when those needs are not met. And I want you to think about it from the standpoint of a kid, but also to understand that that also is the standpoint of as an adult as well. So if we think about it, again, who in here has a baby? Anybody in here ever had a baby before? Okay, yeah, oh man, somebody felt that. So here's the thing, all babies have those universal needs, and in the absence of those needs, they feel uncomfortable, right? And when the baby feels uncomfortable, what do? They cry. They express that need. They make it very clear that something is off. Now, in this positive cycle, that need is met on a consistent basis. Not necessarily perfectly, but consistently. And once that need is met, all of a sudden that baby feels relaxed. And you can literally watch this thing go from something that's screaming its head off like it's been on The Exorcist to something that is just beautiful to take pictures of and post on social media so your friends all want to have kids, right? Now, that's important because it leads to four things. The first thing it establishes is a sense of trust. Trust is foundational to all of us as human beings. I feel like I can trust you, but I also feel like I can trust me. The second thing it establishes is one of the things Tiffany said, security. I feel safe. I feel like I belong. I feel at home. The third thing, it establishes this idea of attunement, which is that we're in sync. We're on the same page. You get me. Whenever I talk about this, I always give the example. For me, when I think of attunement, I think about my 6-year-old who's going to start kindergarten next week. I came from an open house. But I think about the very first time that my wife left me at home with him by myself, and she had an emergency C-section, so it's a longer recovery, but when she had the chance to leave, she was just like, I'm clear. I want to go to the store by myself, figure it out. And I said, okay, whatever's going to make you feel good. So when she left, what do you think my son did? He expressed those needs, right? And I tried first to feed him unsuccessfully, not what he wanted, but that's always what most men think of first. That's why we can't breastfeed. The second thing I tried to do was to walk him around and bounce him and listen to some music. He got louder. Strike 2. Third thing, I take him over to the changing table. I lay him down, and he stops, and there's like a little half grin that comes over his face. And it's like, man, all right, now you're finally getting it right. And when I think of attunement, that's what I think of. It's like, all right, now we're in this together. That's a pretty significant message. We're in this together. You get me. We're fighting together. And the last thing it establishes is this attachment, this bond, this connection. So again, we're talking about babies, but are we just talking about babies right now? No, we're talking about residents of Charlotte. We're talking about residents of Mecklenburg County. There are some people whose cycle of attachment with this community looks like that. Do you guys believe that? Or do y'all think everybody's relationship with this community looks like that? No. We wouldn't be here if it did. Go ahead, Steve. Bounce back one. All right, it didn't make it on. That's okay. That's all right, I can pivot. So, now, here's the other thing. There's also a negative cycle of attachment. Now again, these folks have the exact same needs. All of the things that Tiffany laid out, that Susan laid out, all of these needs are universal. Now they try to cry out and express those needs, but here's where the change happens. Instead of their needs being met consistently, their needs are met inconsistently or not at all. And so even if we thought about a baby for a second, if you were that baby who was hungry, who needed to be changed and everything else, and you cried out, and nobody responded, would you feel relaxed? No. Not at all. You might feel scared. You might feel angry. You might feel confused. All of the above. So when you have that kind of cycle going on, are you developing trust? No. Not at all. I'm learning distrust. I'm learning not to trust you, but I'm also sometimes learning not to trust myself. And instead of security, I'm now developing insecurity. I don't feel like I belong. I don't feel comfortable in my own skin. I don't feel comfortable in my own city or my own county. Whereas you get to call this home, I don't really know where I belong. And instead of attachment, I learned to be unattached. And unattached can show up in a couple of ways. One we don't think of, which means that when I do have an opportunity, I hang on for dear life, often squeezing it too tight and losing it. But on the other side, I just disconnect. I pretty much say, I can't trust you. I know that if I reach out to you, you're not going to meet my needs anyway, so why try at all? Are y'all still with me? So again, I want you to just think for a second. So when we're talking about Brooklyn, and we're talking about a thriving community, we're talking about people living, working, being educated, going to movies and everything like that, and all of a sudden you just get erased. Does that look like that positive cycle or that negative cycle? Yeah. There's a message that is being sent to you. That quote from Tom Hanch's book that basically said, this land is actually too valuable for y'all. You can have it for now, but eventually we are going to have to come back for it because we are worthy of it and you aren't. Go to the next slide. Why these cycles matter is because they develop what we call our core beliefs. My core belief is how I see myself, how I see other people, and how I see the world. Now, if I'm that person who has a need, I reach out to my local officials, I reach out to whomever, and my need is met on a consistent basis, I'm feeling like I'm a pretty good person, right? I'm feeling like I'm a worthy person. I feel like I matter. I'm lovable. When I think about other people, I look at them as relatively helpful, relatively reliable, relatively trustworthy. I know that if I pick up the phone and reach out to so-and-so and I got a need, they're going to help me get it met. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but it'll probably be within 3 days. And the way I see the world as a relatively safe place, as a relatively predictable place, and a fair and just place. Now, if I'm part of that community that just gets wiped out, because again, we use the term urban renewal, that's what it was then, but now we call it gentrification, right? You know, same gift, new wrapping paper. Now, when I realize that I am easily able to be disposed of, do I see myself as lovable and worthy and everything else in this community? No. You know, I'm a pawn. I always call it, we have these development grenades we throw and people are human shrapnel. Wherever you land, who knows? I don't see myself as lovable. I don't see myself as worthy. When it comes to other people, do I think I can trust them? No. They're going to hurt me. Even if they start out seeming like they're going to look out for me, I know in the end they're going to let me down. And when I think of the world, I see the world as dangerous, chaotic, and unjust. Now, here's the thing about that, and I think it's important for us to think about that in terms of Brooklyn, but I also think it's important for us to think about our community right now. When I'm getting that message, and I'm starting to see the world through that lens, not only do I not see you as being bonded to me, but I'm also not bonded to who? So when we talk about, wow, what's going on, we use terms like 50th out of 50 in economic mobility, and we talk about rising homicide rates. Is it really shocking? It's actually basic science. So when we talk about the scope of the injustice, I think it's really important to understand those residual effects. Now here's the upside of this though. In the same way that destructive relationships harm, productive and constructive relationships can help heal. And so when you use a term like restorative, that's what we're talking about here. We don't have the capacity to go back and undo the traumatizing harm, the erasure, the uprooting. Again, this is the we had these nice terms, right? Urban renewal. God, market forces. Everything sounds so sweet and everything else, when the reality is that if one of us goes home tonight and there's somebody in there telling you that you don't live here anymore, how are we feeling then? That's what we did to a community. We had students who literally saw their school, and people fought. Let's be clear, people went and fought to maintain this. So it wasn't, they didn't advocate for themselves. No, people went and fought in the same way that folks in South Charlotte go and fight. The difference was, instead of there being a need met, it was kind of like, yeah, we hear you. Excuse me, get out of the way, we got plans. So as we think about this tonight, again, none of us created all of this situation, but all of us have inherited it. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to continue to be a part of the negative cycle? Or are we going to start being a part of the positive, healing, restorative cycle? So, thank you.
Thank you, Justin. By introducing that element of trauma, we're kind of understanding the scope of the injustice and building the case for why restorative justice needs to happen as it pertains to Brooklyn Village. So the thing is, Charlotte didn't build a single apartment to replace Brooklyn's rundown but affordable shotgun rentals. The resulting housing shortage forced displaced renters into public housing or apartments they couldn't afford. Some people who owned homes and businesses still contend they weren't adequately compensated for their property. Many businesses never reopened. That's it? Okay. Now we're going to have Steve Cohen is going to come and help us understand the contrast of the 2002 Second Ward Master Plan and the current Brooklyn Village Master Plan.
Good evening, everyone. I want to give you a heads up. There's a very important typo that we're going to come across that I'm going to need you to change on that handout that you have of the slides. So if you could make sure you have a pen ready, it's actually pretty important. With that, and I'm still absorbing what I've heard this evening, my words tonight were going to be, we're here because of what happened to Brooklyn, and I'm still digesting that. And we are also here because of Brooklyn Village, which is this proposed development that to many of us just fails to adequately commemorate the losses that it purports to honor. Now, interestingly, this is not Charlotte Mecklenburg's first formal consideration of what to do with that site where Brooklyn used to be located. In 2002, the city got together with the county and they jointly adopted the Second Ward Neighborhood Master Plan. It's fairly detailed, about 80 pages long, and it presented a vision of what a redeveloped Second Ward could look like. Now, what I want to start by doing is comparing the original vision of that 2002 plan with the vision that works its way through the master plan for Brooklyn Village. And I would direct your attention to the slides now. So the 2002 master plan starts with the following vision statement: to create a livable and memorable urban neighborhood in the heart of the city through mixed land uses, diverse architecture and housing types, unique infrastructure, and a hierarchy of open spaces. Sounds like a pretty nice neighborhood. But now pay attention. These components will combine to welcome and support a diverse population with varied ages, races, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Sounds not bad. Sounds not bad. So we then turn to the Brooklyn Village Master Plan, and the county and the developer set out their vision for Brooklyn Village in the preamble to the document that they signed, the master agreement that governs how they're going to do Brooklyn Village. And again, if you look now to the right-hand side of the slide, the goal is to create an active, vibrant, and mixed-income, mixed-use development that advances and furthers the vision of the Second Ward Neighborhood Master Plan. And their vision goes on, as you can see, to quote verbatim the vision of the 2002 Master Plan. So far so good, but sadly, once we get past this bold vision statement, the two master plans dramatically diverge. And at this point, I'll need someone to go page down. Thank you. So on the left, the 2002 master plan, again, 80 pages, it has a lot of information, but I pulled out some of the more important project goals. As touched on, provide a significant diverse residential population with varied ages, races, socioeconomic backgrounds, provide workforce housing in each phase of the development, and to provide the integration of historic references to commemorate what happened throughout the neighborhood for identity. Now, the description that I took of what Brooklyn Village sees itself looking like actually comes from their website, and you're welcome to visit it. So it is just a magnificent mixed-use development. It's beautifully located south of Uptown. What does it have? It's got 243 residential units. By the way, no more than 10% of them are supposed to be affordable to individuals who make 80% or less of the area median income, which would be the classic definition of affordable housing. 170 condominiums, over 700,000 square feet of office space, over 250,000 feet of retail space. Now here, potentially the developer got one thing right, because the retail space is for boutiques, restaurants, and local entrepreneurs. So rather than just populate the development with the big box stores, the national change, there's at least some room perhaps for local business people. There's mention made of cultural space. There's a passage between different portions of the development, Myers Passage, that will have a couple of historical markers. And then finally, of course, any big development, two very nice hotels for people who want to come to Charlotte. As I said, the Brooklyn Village Master Plan just sounds like a magnificent mixed-use development. But the most troubling thing about it is the makeup of the neighbors who are expected to live in Brooklyn Village. So this is the former neighborhood of Brooklyn. Who does the developer contemplate moving in? And so again, we'll look side by side at what the two master plans lay out for housing. In the case of the 2002 master plan, it's pretty straightforward, not very much detail. Workforce housing, teachers, police, all kinds of folks, 55%. Market rate housing, 25%. And then this is the typo, so please get out your pens. It says 10%. This is really meant to be 20% for transitional and affordable housing. And that's going to be very important as we move forward in our advocacy. Because in contrast, if we go to the right-hand side, the Brooklyn Village Master Plan only provides for 10% of the units to be affordable, and all the rest are market rate. There's no workforce housing, there's no transitional housing. We've got 10%, and then everything else is market. And I'm not going to get too wonky today, though I could because I've spent time with the document, but there are distribution requirements that very carefully govern what kind of people who need affordable housing can live there. So again, there's one thing that the new development gets right. 3% of the units, so this would be 30% of the affordable units, are allocated to households up to 60% of AMI. And here's the key. The developer, the development must be made available to people who have housing choice or Section 8 vouchers. That's a big deal in Charlotte because, as many of you may know, there are a number of landlords who won't take the housing choice vouchers. But let's get back to the makeup of the affordable housing community. So 7% of the units, so 70% of the affordable units are a combination of either households that are almost not in need of affordable housing, so between 61 and 80% of AMI, or they get allocated to seniors at 30% of AMI. So in other words, seniors who may be on a fixed income, who are nice and quiet and aren't going to be bothersome neighbors. So at the end of the day, there's nothing in here that would require or even incentivize the developer to provide affordable housing for a family at 30% of AMI. It's more like all of the 30% of AMI and below housing is most likely to be allocated just to seniors. Well, I think I'm going to lift my head up from the weeds. To sum up, it's clear, I think to me, and I hope to you, that the county has very strongly departed from its inclusive vision in the 22 master plan, which contemplated that Brooklyn Village would be advancing and furthering the 2002 master plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening. I'm Corinne Mack. My question tonight is, why now? My statement is, if not now, when? We've been blessed to see many of the Democratic presidential candidates raise the issue of reparations. But to some folks, reparations is a bad word, even a cuss word. And so we use the term restorative justice. Sounds a little softer, but it means the same thing. In Charlotte, when you think about Brooklyn Village, no matter how folks try to make it look like something different, it really was displacement of Black people. It was a distribution of wealth. In this case, the wealth was distributed somewhere else, and that's not new. It's historic in the Black community. What we're looking at now is an opportunity for the people of Charlotte to be the flagship for the rest of this country, for Black and white, Christian and Jew, and Muslim, gay and straight, young and old, to make a decision to come together, to stop the spirit of hate. Because the theft, the displacement, the trauma done in Black communities is all part of the spirit of hate. It comes out of the idea that a certain group, in this case, white, well-to-do whites, are privileged and have the right that a Black person does not have. It comes out of the idea that Black people do not have worth, and that just is not so. When we look into history and think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, many of us who study history get very excited about the Black Wall Street. But Brooklyn Village to Charlotte was our Black Wall Street. Dismantled, and thousands of people displaced. Think about the children who are being raised in that environment of love and of security, and what it must have felt like for each one of those children once they were displaced out of Brooklyn Village. And the question is, what has happened to those children? What has happened to those families? We heard Willie and Steve and Justin talk about gentrification. But for Black people, it's much more deeper than a word. We live with that trauma. And many in this room are still living with that trauma. To be in a city that's being beautified, in the downtown or uptown part of Charlotte, however you say it, to see us create beautiful murals and spend millions of dollars on bridges and millions of dollars on sports arenas, but not be intentional about spending millions of dollars, about uplifting Black people, about ensuring that they have not only clean housing, but fair housing. To have leadership begin to converse about affordable housing, and affordable housing means $55,000 a year for a family of 4, knowing that most workers in the Charlotte area only make $8.40 to $9 an hour. We do not make a living wage. Therefore, those Black people who were displaced also are dealing with jobs that feel very much as if they're indentured slaves. Speak to some of the folks who came out of Brooklyn and the smiles that come over their face, the pride that they feel when they talk about what it felt like to live there and what it also felt like at the point when they were told they had to leave. How hurt they feel and still feel. Brooklyn Village and what happened in Brooklyn Village is indicative of what's happening everywhere in this city where it's predominantly African Americans residing. We came together because Willie Keaton had a vision. And each of us who were part of this team bought into that vision because that vision was also our vision. That Black people would be treated justly and fairly. And if nobody would stand up, we would stand up. But I'm here to tell you this. We're going to have some other conversations. Everyone in this room has a responsibility and an accountability to what's happening in Brooklyn Village. We don't simply blame the developer. Mr. Peoples is a developer who's in the business of making money. He happens to be someone who's willing to have a conversation, prayerfully. But the question is, what are we willing to do? Who are we willing to hold accountable? And how hard are we going to fight to ensure that Black people, I want you to hear me clearly, because sometimes we lose that conversation by talking about everyone else but Black people. We're talking about Black people who were displaced. Are we willing to stand for those Black families, those Black bodies, those Black lives, those Black children? Are we willing to be very clear about the responsibility we have to ensure that we no longer will be number 50 in this country and that we would no longer be ashamed about how we treat black people in this city. Charlotte will be the flagship for the rest of this country. We'll stand with you. We'll stand with you. We'll stand with you. God bless you.
Certainly want to thank Minister Mack, who's doing a great job leading the NAACP here in Charlotte. We're under the section called Frequently Asked Questions. Right? Frequently asked questions. There are questions that are being asked as we were organizing through the process, and so we wanted to kind of address some of those. And we're going to take a couple minutes because we're going to kind of speed things along. We want to be respectful of your time, having come out tonight. And Minister Mack, President of the NAACP, she answered the first one, why now? If not now, then when, right? But the next question I want to answer, and I've been hearing this, is, was the displacement necessary? There's been this idea that there was so much blight and so much crime that they had to raise the homes, they had to relocate the people, and urban renewal actually was somehow a good thing. It's kind of been one of the questions. So was displacement necessary? So what we did was, this was a quote that I found in my research from someone who was from Brooklyn, and it says, I didn't know anything about urban renewal until my grandparents were forced to sell their home. The word was that the city officials had made their decision on what they wanted to do with Brooklyn, and they used the term blight to describe where we were living. Our house was in a neighborhood where everyone owned their house. We're talking about really nice houses with yards and old trees. There were areas where the housing was bad, but we had some very nice houses in Brooklyn. And I did some research, and I found that it looks as though City Council at that time brought in an independent person to do some research. I use the term independent in quotation mark, because they went in and kind of looked for what they wanted to look for, and then reported back to City Council. But there were very nice houses in Brooklyn and businesses. Go to the next one. And this was kind of, the teachers were representatives of the professional class in Brooklyn. So we're talking about teachers who worked in Second Ward, teachers who worked at the elementary school, but also teachers who worked at Johnson C. Smith, Barber Scotia, Livingston College. They all lived in the community with the students, and people knew who they were. You know, it was so this assumption that the whole neighborhood was blighted, and so it was necessary to displace, and therefore is not injustice, and it's actually something that was good. That is something that is ridiculous. And it says here, when the schools was demolished, we lost something that gave us hope that we could do whatever we put our minds to. It also showed us that the city didn't care about us. And this is a listening session. Those are voices that have come from people who actually impacted. So now we're going to answer the next question, and we're calling on Pastor Reggie Tuggle from Greer Heights Presbyterian Church, a very important part of this organizing process, to come answer that question.
Thank you, Dr. Keaton. Good evening. One of the questions that came to our attention was that we, as an organizing entity, are fighting the black developer who was assigned or had won the bid to do this project. Nothing is farther from the truth. In fact, we are grateful that the developer is an African American. Spread the wealth, so to speak. And so we're not fighting him at all. That is, he's not on our agenda to be opposed. We're not doing that. What we are opposed to is the lack of or the absence of restorative justice. there was an act of inequity created deliberately or unwittingly that needs to be addressed by the powers that be. The developer probably responded to an RFP, request for proposal, but in our mind, the proposal left out some very critical areas regarding restorative justice. People who are displaced, businesses that were closed, churches that were abolished, there was no reference to restoring any of that. So we're asking the developer to listen, pay attention to what the community is saying. We need you to make some adjustments in your proposal to accommodate some of the injustices that were created 20, 30 years ago. And we're asking him to be mindful of who he is. Work with the community here in Charlotte. It's not too late. You can amend the plans to incorporate all the things that we're asking for, and it is not too much to ask. Thank you.
So the next frequently asked question is, should we be content with 35% minority women and small business enterprise that's allocated or identified in the contract? And so what that means is that the developer is establishing what he's calling a goal to include 35% minority women and small business enterprise participation. And even though that number, it seems like a lot, but when you really, they say the devil is in the details. When you think about, you're going to have to go to the 2002 disparity study of Mecklenburg County and put those numbers in contrast to what he is stating that as a goal. Because the reality is that there's only about 5% availability for African American contractors, Black American owned, there's only 5%. So out of the 35% minority women and small business enterprise, the reality is that there is not enough what they're calling availability to even get the 35%. And I know in other places, in other counties, I'm not saying they do that here, but what happens is that businesses are put in the name of their wives. And so here in Mecklenburg County, we're talking 12% non-Hispanic white women owned as opposed to 5% of Black owned. So that means, again, that even though the number says we'll get 35%, but because it's minority women and small business enterprise, that does not really mean that Black-owned businesses are going to benefit substantially. In 2017, Black-owned, in terms of utilization, was only 2.9%. 2.9% utilization. And so therefore, we have to ask for more than 35% minority women and small business enterprise, because that is not enough. The restorative justice is going to have to come from other areas as opposed to construction and contracts. Now, we're going to ask Reverend Glency Redrick to come, and I hope I said her last name right, to come and do the next question. What is restorative justice?
Good evening. Actually, the question has been answered over and over since we've been here. What is restorative justice? And as I have listened, as I have witnessed, as I have lived and watched my family live, I want to create a statement, because you can look it up on Google to find out what is restorative justice. But when we think about community and when we think about human beings and when we think about the value of life, what is restorative justice? So I say restorative justice is a cry from our ancestors from as far back as the first African who was set on this continent that came here against their will to work for free. What is restorative justice? While we cannot bring back those lives, while we cannot give back their land, what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is a responsibility of each of us in this room, black and white, to say that enough is enough, to say that we will no longer stand by and watch government, our city council, take it all the way back to our presidents of the United States, that we will no longer tolerate people being moved for the value of others. When we look at the presentation that has been given of Brooklyn, there was wealth, there was value, there was safety, but safety went out of the window, value went out of the window, the land quality and economic standpoint went out of the window because someone who did not look like us demonized and minimized our worth. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is a responsibility for each of us in this room to say no more and to make sure that those who are experiencing unemployment or underemployment, to make sure that they have a home to live in that they can be proud of. When we looked at the slides, we talked about, again, how those who lived in Brooklyn owned their homes. Yes. And now we're talking about putting persons in apartments. That is a great disgrace. Yes. And we should not sit around and allow that to happen. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is us taking on the responsibility and the ownership to make sure it doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Excellent. At this time, as we move along, we want to start hearing from some of the descendants of Brooklyn. And so we're going to ask that they give us about 5 minutes. Cynthia Reel, we ask that she come at this time.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Cynthia Boyd Reel, and I give you my maiden name because I was born Cynthia Boyd at 921 East 3rd Street in Brooklyn. And it is that experience, is that being that colors everything I do and every thought I have. You know, I was sitting here listening, and I was thinking, particularly when Pastor Mack said, what about the children? Because, you know, I write about Brooklyn too. And I always look at, I write the stories because my daughter, her daughter, their children will not experience the House of Prayer parade or the band practice on Wednesday night on the corner. They will not eat double scoop ice creams at El Chico's. They will not pocket their Sunday school money to go to Charlie's Bakery. They will not sneak in the Savoy Theater by saying my mama sent me to get my brother and go in there and sit down. They will not experience the thrill of the Queen City Classic. That's right. You know, of attending my historic elementary school, Myers Street, where I had a part-time job in the first grade because Mr. Wardell would not let the students come out to my granddaddy's store. So he said to my teacher, who lived up the street, I need that one at 12 o'clock every day. So I passed orange juice, cartons of milk, honey buns, and cinnamon buns across the fence at the Second Ward Gym from my grandmother's store on Myers Street. You know, I came along in a community where we were the most important thing. Everybody was invested in our success. You see, Brooklyn was more than those houses or so-called slums that we lived in. It was more than a piece of land. It was the spirit of Brooklyn. It was the heart of Brooklyn. It was the love, because that's what it was. You know, at 5 and 6 years old, I could go anywhere I wanted to go without fear, and I did. I went down behind houses to get to the old house of prayer to buy that 5-cent cup of banana pudding from Sister Sadie.
My God.
I went down to Jimmy the Midget's store to buy kits and whatever else my pennies would buy. And Jimmy the Midget didn't look like me, but he was Jimmy the Midget. And we all know, because he looked out for us too. Old ladies could report where I was any time of day because they watched us. They cared about us. They invested in us. You know, the lady that pierced my ears when I was 6 lived 3 houses down the street from me. You know, later across the street from me would hang the tops of Royal Crown grease on your ear and straighten your hair. You know, if you didn't have it and your neighbors had it, you had it. You know, when my granddaddy killed hogs, everybody helped to process the meat and everybody ate. You know, we had reno roasts in the front yard. So see, that's the Brooklyn that I remember. That's the Brooklyn that makes my eyes tear up every time I come down McDowell Street. Because I learned to cross the street at McDowell and trade because my older auntie was tired of my brother leaving me at the kindergarten late because he was out playing. So I learned to cross the street. You know, I went to Clark store. You know, I ran all over Brooklyn because I could. When I was coming today, I passed by the corner of Brevard and 3rd. And that building still sits there where the Pasadena Beauty Parlor was, where we used to go to get our hair fixed. I was baptized in St. Paul Baptist Church on McDowell Street. My brother went to Pearson Studio every Sunday to take a picture in his suit for a quarter. You know, I'm here because I keep saying this. What we are doing is for the children.
That's right.
You know, it's for them that they can know where they came from. That there is something deeper than, you know, and we need the restorative justice, but we also need restored that feeling of community. That's right. The love that put the children first. Yes. The common bond that even somebody that didn't like you, if something happened to you, they would not let Thompsons take your children. Right. They say, they're my cousin, and they would feed them, make sure they got to school. Now, when you got back, you couldn't come to their house to get them, but they would send them home to you. Nice, shiny, and pressed. See, those are the people that we descend from. Those are the people that I remember, you know, and those are the people that I try to emulate in my exchanges with my people, even the ones that don't look like me. Somebody told me that, you know, love was the only weapon for which there is no defense. Wow. Amen. And it's that love that they instilled in us, that they role model for us, that has brought us to this moment. All of this is the result of their prayers, of their faith, of their believing in love and community when it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And just for the record, that apartment that we got moved in when I was 9 years old, when I came up from school and my mom said we got to move, and the selling point for the guy that was representing the city was that now we didn't have to make heat in a cold stove. Well, my thing was it was warm, but anyway, but now we have heat coming out of the walls. But the reality is, heat was not the only thing coming out of the walls. There was also roaches and mice that I did not see in my dilapidated so-called house over in the slum of Brooklyn. Wow. Thank you for your attention and your time.
You know, when you hear stories like that, you know, you can't help but ask yourself, what would Charlotte be like if Brooklyn was never destroyed? Right? We're going to ask Camille Murray to come at this time. Give him a big hand. He's a black business owner in South Park, and I asked him to come. His family is also from Brooklyn. Thank you, brother.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Camille Murray. I'm a 4th generation Charlottean. And that may not mean too much to a lot of you all, but when I walk around and people call me a unicorn, like, you're from Charlotte? Yeah, there are people that have been here for a long time. My father, his family, they lived in Brooklyn. My grandmother attended Second Ward High School. She worked at Good Samaritan Hospital. So those stories that you were speaking of, that touched my heart, because those are the stories that I heard. Those are the stories that I grew up with, listening to those stories, especially about the Queen City Classic. Everybody talked about that game between 2nd Ward and West Charlotte and how important it was. One of the things as a business owner is you always think about location. You want the best location for you to be able to sell what you're selling. And I think putting a restorative or restoring that area is very important and vital because it's downtown. It is, I mean, everybody goes through this area. So why shouldn't we have a part of it? We had a part of it, and we still should have a part of it. And I think that's very important when you're talking about being a small business owner and wanting to get out in the community and be a part of the community. I chose South Park area because it's a very vibrant community. I didn't choose where I live in the university area. Why? Because I wanted a vibrant community. And I would love to be able to come downtown and do the same thing. I own a dry cleaners in South Park. If you ever know what the Earth Fair, just a small plug, the Earth Fair grocery store is, I'm Barnes & Noble. I'm located right there in that area. But it's just the thing of being able to come to an area knowing that I feel comfortable. The Cheers show put it best. You want to come somewhere where everybody knows your name. And that's the thing that my father talked about all the time. Being able to walk out of your house and not worry about anything. Knowing that your teacher was 2 or 3 houses down from you. Your pastor was 4 or 5 houses down from you. So you really didn't have to worry about it because people knew you. So when your mom came to the school and said, yeah, that boy was acting up, hey, I believe it because I know you. And those are the connections that we have to think about. One of the things I didn't see, and I'm going to say this and I'm going to sit down, I saw the apartment part of it. I saw a lot of those things. Ownership is a big part of land and owning those things. School, one of the major schools, 2nd Ward, was taken away from that area. Well, what did that mean? That means that those kids were displaced. I'm a part of that displacement in the 70s when we were bused from the west side and had to travel all the way over to the east side to be schooled. Those are the things that we have to think about, and I think the biggest thing that we have to think about is connections. How do we connect with each other? The reason why we have so many homicides this year in Charlotte is because we're not connected. That's right. I don't know you. And those are the things that we just have to get back to. So thank you, and I appreciate the time.
And that's a powerful point. I mean, when you think about 2nd Ward being torn down, a school being torn down, and you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what was rebuilt where what was torn down? And one of the things that was rebuilt, they built a jail there. Right. And you have to kind of ask yourself, was there a methodology behind that, where we tear down a school and we rebuild and build a jail there? And so what we want to do now is we want to open the floor to other Brooklynites. You want to come up? You want to yeah, if you would like to.
I know, but not everyone can hear.
Let me see. Come on up here.
You gonna go first? Yeah.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? What do we do here?
Maybe your phone. Maybe your phone.
Oh, let me get that out of the way. I do have some,
Let me speak.
Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend DeWitt Mobley, and I'm here with my organization, Black Men with a Purpose. And I want to talk a little bit about what's already been talked about. I want to talk about the educators. If you go to our website, we got a web page called blackmenwithapurposeincorporated.com. And on that website, you'll see our history. And in that history, the first thing we talk about is Second Ward, West Charlotte, York Road. These were the schools that we came out of. I also went to Miles Street too. But those teachers, they invested in us. Like has already been said, they were part of our community and they cared about us. That's something that you don't get much today. And so in our mission statement, we want to give back to the community. Our motto is reaching back to pull forward. All right. And that's what was done for us when we was coming up. And tell you a funny story about Maya Street. You know, educators are very important in our lives. Yes. But I had the distinct privilege. My first grade teacher at Maya Street School taught my mother, taught my oldest brother, and taught me too. That's three generations, you know. And it just, and then my third grade teacher at Maya Street, I used to be a bad boy. So she used to come home with me. And it just occurred to me while I was listening to Sister Boyd talking that she must have lived in the neighborhood because we walked from Maya Street to the corner of First and Davison, where I lived at 602 East First Street, and she walked to my house and talked to my mama, walking. So she didn't have two parts. I didn't know where she lived because I never got to go to her house. She used to have a party every Friday for the best group in my class. Not at her house, but at school. I never got to go to her parties because I was always bad. But I remember on the last day of school, she said, I'm having a party for everybody at my house. So I know she lived in the neighborhood. Everybody but me. And lo and behold, this little girl got sick and she couldn't go to the party. And there was another little bad boy in my class, I can't think his name, but Miss Cook said, pick one of those boys to go in your place. And I picked DeWitt. I couldn't stand to be treated nice. So I put a thumbtack in her chair. Boy, she jumped up out of that chair crying. But I just wanted to say that it was the community that made Second Ward in Brooklyn what it was. It was the community. Hey, sis. Okay. Thank you for that.
Hello, friends of Brooklyn. I do have some notes here because I'm a terrible public speaker. My name is Calvin Simmons. I know that part by heart. But I am, too, a member of Black Men with Purpose. I was born at Good Samaritan Hospital, or as they say now, born on the 40-yard line of Panther Stadium.
Yeah, right.
I grew up in a fourplex over on Cleveland Avenue. I went to St. Paul Baptist Church where I was baptized. At that time, it was located at 515 South McDowell. And Cynthia, you might be too young to remember Reverend James F. Wirtz, but he was my pastor at the time. Again, too, I went to Second Ward High School. Basically, what I wanted to tell you is this. Please do not sell yourself too short because I'm currently working with an author by the name of Larry Kenneth Alexander and a professor emeritus at Macalester College. She's working on a book called Hidden in a Book. And the subtitle is 40 Acres and a Mule, cross that out, 40 trillion and a mule, because the professor is also the founder and CEO of 1,500 scholars, and they're called Historians Against Slavery. And they hired a big data econometrician that has determined that the economic value of African slave labor to the American colonies from 1619 to Emancipation Proclamation of 1865 was between 29 and 40 trillion dollars. Hence the subtitle of the book. And so basically, what I did, I got together, sent a copy of it to the president, John Cunningham. I called a fellow over at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I asked for at least Black Men with a Purpose, can we get an intern to do grant writing for us? And he was really excited about it. And at the same time, I told him about the Brooklyn neighborhood. And I said, you know, they could use an econometrician as well, because they have no idea of what the value of their displacement. Yes. And basically, he was giddy as a schoolgirl. And he said, yeah, let's get together. And I think a lot of interns would be happy to do that from the graduate school. And he did add that to promise them a little stipend would make them more enthusiastic. But your group could probably afford to hire an econometrician. And basically, if this econometrician that the historians hired can go back 4 centuries, an econometrician that we hire can definitely go back a half a century, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And someone mentioned about the trauma effect of slavery. I would invite everybody to read a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGruy. And what she has found out after 12 years of study, that the trauma is passed down psychologically through the generations.
White and black.
White and black. And to that extent, you have black kids now. They did a study 10 years ago. They said, which doll is the best? They showed them a white doll and a black doll. And the black kid pointed to the white doll as being better. And they did the same study 10 years later, and guess what? Same result. And so I don't know if the psychological aspects of this can be quantified, but they do have a study. John Conyers in Congress passed the torch to Sheila Jackson Lee. They've got a bill in Congress called H.R. 40, where they are going to do a study of the impact of slavery. Amen. And I say that get together with your elderly residents from St. Paul, from the Brooklyn area, get together with an econometrician, and find out exactly what your value is. That would be the businesses, the churches, and now that I've learned today, maybe even the homeowners who own property in that Brooklyn area. Find out what your value is.
Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
At this time, we're going to have, we are honored and blessed to have former Congressman Mel Watt, and he's going to come and say a few words. Give him a big hand as he comes at this time.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is a pleasure to be back as a full-time resident of Charlotte. Not that I ever left officially, but I obviously earlier this year retired and returned. And this is, I'm trying to find a way to figure out how to address something that has been going on throughout my entire life. So I want to applaud the movement that this meeting represents to find a constructive way to move forward so that we don't have to keep repeating this over and over and over again. That's right. I was not raised in Brooklyn or Second Ward. I was born in 1945 in the Good Samaritan Hospital, where the Panthers Stadium is now located. So what has happened to Brooklyn and Second Ward happened to Third Ward. And we see the result. I dated a young lady who lived at the corner of McDowell and at the bottom of the place where Walton Plaza is, when I was a senior in high school. So I spent a lot of time in Brooklyn and Second Ward. I joined the parade every time Sweet Daddy Grace came to Charlotte. I'm not sure whether you have the House of Prayer on the list of churches. Is it? I couldn't find it. And that was in 1962. And Brooklyn and Second Ward were vibrant communities at that time. And I can relate to a lot of the testimony that has already been given. They then called it urban renewal, which took place during, I suppose, the 7 years that I was gone from Charlotte. 4 years at the University of North Carolina and 3 more years in law school out of state. But when I returned to Charlotte in 1971, some of you may recall that well, you wouldn't recall that, but I would recall it vividly. The very night that I returned to join the Julius Chambers law firm was the night that the law office on 10th Street was firebombed. And as a result of that firebombing, we were left without a place to practice law. And we moved into the White House Inn in uptown Charlotte, which is now gone, of course. But we immediately set our sights on developing a project that we could locate our offices in, and we could restore some semblance of minority business ownership. And what was available at that time, because all of the housing had been removed by 1971, was the site that is now the Walton Plaza. So some of you may recall that that was the first development that I, as a lawyer, participated in developing. And we had the struggle then because the city and the county had no interest in selling that property to us. And we had to threaten to file a lawsuit, and they said, well, you got to go through the bid process. And we said, yeah, we're willing to go through the bid process, but if you don't assure at the end of that bid process that we get the property, you're going to have a lawsuit on your hands. And so they cleared I remember this, they cleared the bid process for us. And we constructed what was East Independence Plaza, a 100,000 square foot office building, where we restored to this community a branch of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, and some semblance, but that was the only business development that, as a result of urban removal, as we called it, was ever restored to the Brooklyn Second Ward community. So there's plenty of history here, and now it is repeating itself. And we have seen the price of progress. Heck, I was raised in Dixie on the other side of the airport, and you talk about the price of progress. Look at the growth of the airport and its impact on the community, Steel Creek, Berry Hill, Dixie communities that I grew up in. So we paid that price of progress repeatedly over and over again. Fast forward to 1992, when I ran for Congress, and the Earl Village redevelopment had already been approved by the time I got elected to Congress in 1993. And the major issue there was, what are you going to do with the black people and the poor people who you're moving out of Earl Village? Where are they going to go? They don't have any place to go other than to the west side of town, which will more segregate the city of Charlotte, an already segregated city. So one of the first projects I undertook as a member of Congress was to write into the law in any future Hope 6 project that was developed a one-for-one replacement requirement. If you move a black poor person out of this neighborhood, you've got to move a black poor person back into this neighborhood once the renovations have taken place. Now that can be in a number of different forms. If you move out 30 residents and you build 100 units, 30 of those residents have got to be us. The other 70, you can make whatever profit you want to make on them, and that became the law, and it applied to Piedmont Courts. Piedmont Courts is different. It applied to what used to be Fairview Homes. That's a different community. It's racially and economically integrated. It applied to the development out off of West Boulevard. They changed all the names of these communities, by the way, in the process. What was that? Dalton Village, yeah. It's called Arbor something now, Arbor Glen now. But these things can be addressed. We have to figure out a constructive way to address them. And one of the reasons I told Reverend Keating that I wanted to be here tonight is that I want to try to figure out, help try to figure out that constructive process. I happen to know Mr. Peebles. He was actually the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Board while I was in Congress. So I know he is not a bad person, but he is a profit-oriented person. And so what we need to do is try to figure out a constructive way to engage him and create some dialogue so that we can figure out a way forward. And we need, going forward, to insist that history be taken into account in every decision that gets made, and that an element of restorative justice, as the term has been adopted here, is involved in every one of these decisions that we make going forward. Whether it's Greer Heights, whether it is Dixie, and they're talking about building another Ballantine on that side of the airport now. So it's still going on, and we've got to figure out a constructive way to address it. And I'm committing myself to try to be a constructive force here. I mean, there's nothing we can do to turn to replace Brooklyn and Second Ward, but we can find some equity and restorative justice in the process of moving forward. And that's what we have to find a way to do in our city. I thank you for allowing me to say those words, and I hope that we can find that constructive process.
I'm Rabbi Judy Schindler, and it's an honor to stand before you. There are many more stories. How many of you grew up in Brooklyn or had family in Brooklyn? So we want your stories. Andrew, raise your hand. Andrew is over there, and we will get your stories. So please share with us your stories so that we can tape them and post them. So please, please, please make sure we have your names, we have your stories, so that we can share them. We are on a journey to justice. You make sure if people leave, you get their names. Okay. We are on a journey to justice, and I have a question. Will you join us? We are on a journey to justice. Can you say, I will join you?
I will join you.
Okay. Uprooted community, erasing community, closing black churches in the midst of the civil rights movement, closing businesses, closing schools, closing off opportunity, destruction, devastation, trauma, despair. I think about the sins of the soil on which white Charlotte stands. And I think about the soul of the black community stolen from the heart of our city. As Justin Perry said, relationships harm and relationships heal. We are on a journey to restorative justice. It's not just Brooklyn Village. It's about every development from this point forward. Can we be that flagship city that says enough is enough? We are on a journey to justice. Will you join us? We're going to start with organizations. We're going to ask some organizations to stand up and share that they are joining us on this journey. And then we're going to ask individuals. As you leave, you'll see posters that say, what does restorative justice mean to you? Please write down what it means in terms of mental health and education and economic justice and many other realms. Please post on Facebook. Please write to the Charlotte Observer. Say, this is what restorative justice looks like to us. So the first organization we invite to stand up for justice is Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice.
Thank you. I serve as the co-chair for Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice. Whereas in February of 1960, the city of Charlotte made promises to African Americans living in Second Ward and Brooklyn to provide affordable housing that were never fulfilled. The Charlotte Observer reported Vernon Sawyer, director of the Charlotte Urban Redevelopment Commission, stood before some 150 residents of the city in Brooklyn neighborhood and attempted to reassure them. When the time comes to move, he promised, you'll be given help in finding good homes you can afford. That promise was never kept, and the city did not offer affordable, suitable relocation housing for most of the Brooklyn residents. Whereas from 1960 to 1967, Brooklyn was razed, and not one new residential unit was built in Brooklyn to replace the 1,480 destroyed homes, the 1,007 families that were displaced, the 216 black businesses that were closed, and the 12 African American churches that were forced to close their doors. Whereas the county is now moving forward with plans for a $700 million development
called Brooklyn Village to be built on that land, the fact that most African Americans will not be able to afford to live in the luxury apartment units or rent the retail space and office space is compounding the historical injustice already committed against thousands of African Americans in the 1960s and the early 1970s. Many people of color currently living in Charlotte are not financially able to support this type of lifestyle. The atrocities experienced by an already marginalized group of citizens of this city certainly should press the hearts of the morally aware to make a different decision. Therefore, be it resolved that Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice calls for restorative justice and healing as it pertains to the Brooklyn Village development. Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice is calling for a restorative justice process entailing a public acknowledgement of wrongs that have been done and committing to concrete steps to repairing the harm that has been caused. We invite the CCJ membership, their parishioners, and the broader community that is committed to justice in Charlotte to attend not only this restorative justice listening session, but any in the future. Thank you.
We invite Carolina Jews for Justice.
Good evening. My name is Janet Ganung. I'm a founding member of Carolina Jews for Justice Greater Charlotte, and we are honored to enter into the record this evening our resolution for restorative justice in Brooklyn Village. Whereas the Charlotte City Council voted in 1958 to embark on what it termed urban renewal, which was cover language for the destruction of the thriving community of Brooklyn in 2nd Ward, whereas the travesty of what white Charlotte promoted to the Brooklyn community as progress was in reality the embodiment of the injustices described in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, whereas an entire self-sustaining and destination center of black culture was willfully obliterated by Charlotte leaders in the 1960s and early 1970s, whereas 219 businesses had to close because the community of patrons on which they relied had been displaced to other parts of the city and beyond. Whereas the displacement of over 1,000 families helped create what is known today as the Crescent and the Wedge, a more segregated Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which has been recognized as an extremely significant contributor to economic inequality and disparity in access to opportunity. Whereas this displacement also resulted in many individuals and families and their descendants moving away from Charlotte-Mecklenburg because of the limited opportunities for decent, affordable housing and jobs available to them. Whereas the raising of 1,480 homes in Brooklyn without a single replacement unit erased millions of dollars of generational wealth that could have been passed down within families. And whereas the destruction of inspiring and grounding centers such as churches and schools created trauma and adverse childhood experiences that impact families to this day, now therefore be it resolved that the Carolina Jews for Justice Greater Charlotte urges the City of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County to publicly acknowledge that the policies of its predecessors did a grave injustice to the residents of the Brooklyn community and to generations of their families, urges the Board of County Commissioners to reopen negotiations on the development of Brooklyn Village, proposes that in a revised agreement for the development of Brooklyn Village as an act of restorative justice, the retail businesses that eventually occupy the new Brooklyn Village include a meaningful percentage of African American businesses that will be offered rental subsidies so that their rent will be affordable to them, proposes that as restorative justice to Brooklyn community, The mixed income development of Brooklyn Village include at least 20% affordable units, of which half of those be designated for families earning 30% of area median income and below, and proposes the creation of a restorative justice fund to provide supportive services, including mental health counseling for generational trauma, early childhood and after-school educational support, workforce training and placement, guidance and mentoring toward home ownership, entrepreneurial training, and more, to individuals and families directly or indirectly impacted by the destruction of the Brooklyn community, as well as to eligible recipients in Charlotte-Mecklenburg's broader African American community. Entered this 22nd day of August 2019 by Carolina Jews for Justice, Greater Charlotte.
We invite Dr. Ben Boswell of Myers Park Baptist Church.
Thank you. I don't have my own resolution, but I do stand representing our church to support both the resolution of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice and the Carolina Jews for Justice, Greater Charlotte, and I just want to mention why we stand for that as a church, Myers Park Baptist. First, tonight I was moved very much by hearing about how this community, Brooklyn, would have been and was the Myers Park of the black community. And so as the pastor of people who are still now living in Myers Park, it is important for us to support efforts for restorative justice in the Charlotte community. A couple of years ago, our church went through a year-long series of education called Awakening to Racial Injustice, and then we took a pilgrimage through the Deep South that some of you participated with us, touring civil rights sites together with Mayfield Memorial Missionary Baptist Church in the Hidden Valley neighborhood, which is one of our partner churches in the city. And afterwards, we developed this statement, and this statement is why I can stand here today on behalf of our church, not just as a clergy person who is free to speak his mind on the issues of justice, but also to speak on behalf of our church for this. We wrote this statement and approved it as a congregation. Racism against African Americans still permeates our systems, institutions, and churches. This racism continues systemic oppression that was instituted with slavery and was reiterated in the Jim Crow era. Today, this racism takes shape through mass incarceration, economic and social exclusion, and lack of access to education, healthcare, housing, and employment. As people of faith, we will work to educate on white privilege, to dismantle racism, and to denounce white supremacy in every iteration until all people, regardless of race, are fully affirmed, welcomed, and included in the social and economic fabric of our society. And so, in keeping with that statement, we support both resolutions tonight and join in efforts for restorative justice. Thank you.
One Mac. Does One Mac have a resolution?
The Olive Rose League. One Mac Affordable Housing has signed on in full support of restorative justice for Brooklyn.
Kirsten Sickley of the YWCA, are you still here? Thanks.
Good evening. I'm Kirsten Sickley with YWCA Central Carolinas. I've worked for the YWCA for 25 years and arrived there 30 years after the Brooklyn Village was raised. The story I always heard was that we had a wonderful black women's branch called the Phyllis Wheatley branch in Brooklyn Village, and that as we built our new branch on Park Road at 3420 Park Road, we opened with a merged staff. The first executive director was a woman of color, Mickey Riddick, married to Leon Riddick, and we had a merged board and staff, and that was a wonderful kumbaya story to me. We have 2 scrapbooks at the YWCA that are sitting in my office that I've been pouring through with yellowed newspaper clippings written by, of course, mostly white male journalists, echoing the white male city fathers' perspective of what was happening. And word after word after word in the headlines talks about Brooklyn Village in terms of slums and blighted. And it was important to me, and I'm still on this journey, to learn what our role was and how we might have been complicit. And so it's been wonderful to read that the YWCA women were a bit of a thorn in the side of Vernon Sawyer and were not going to sell the property, but frankly, they weren't offering us a dime for it, I understand, because we were going to have additional value by the work they were doing. On the other hand, they offered the YMCA $9,000 for their property at the McCrory branch. But ultimately, we sold that land to First Baptist Church. And I understood after talking to Arthur Griffin this week that of the 11 churches that were dismantled and eliminated, all black churches, there had been a pledge that no churches would be built again in Brooklyn Village. But First Word Church, a white church, was built, and we sold our land to them. And so we stand with all of you and the other organizations that have made resolutions and statements today to say we cannot, as a YWCA, live authentically our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women and promoting peace and justice and freedom and dignity for all people if we don't own our part in this history. So thank you for letting us be here tonight.
NAACP, do you want to stand up and commit?
I don't have a proclamation or a resolution, but what I will say is this. Each of us have to have a self-examination, each of us. And we must commit to change. We must do more than we've ever done before. For my white sisters and brothers in this room, especially those who have stood before us and spoke truth to power, your part in the displacement and harm to black people, thank you. We need to hear that more often. Not only hear that, we need to do that more often. It is so important that we get back to our true humanity. Because of what's happening in this country, we have lost the sense of humanity. And I still believe that perfect love casts out all fear. I still believe that love has to be the foundation of all things. And so I hope that tonight, when we leave here with a real sense of our individual responsibility and our corporate responsibility to ensure that in this city, we say enough is enough. And we say that love will be the foundation of all things. God bless you.
So the NAACP, I believe, joins on this path to restorative justice. The Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice commits its organization to the journey to restorative justice. Are there any other organizations tonight who want to sign on to this journey to restorative justice? Harvesting Humanity signs on to the journey to restorative justice. Any other organizations?
The Lionel Lee Jr. Center for Wellness.
Okay, we want to acknowledge all of our city representatives and county commissioners. If you're a public official, please rise so we can thank you for your presence and support. Pat Coffin. Pat Catham voted no on Brooklyn Village. Susan Hardin, the new county commissioner, she said, Stan Greenspon Center, you have to look at this a little more closely. And State Representative Kelly Alexander, you have a story when it comes to Brooklyn. You lived in Brooklyn, and so you are committed to it, and we want to hear your story, but the hour is late. So please sign on as individuals, leave your name. Please, we'll let you close it out. Do you want to close it out for us, my friend and colleague?
Thank you. I know this has been sort of a marathon night, but we really appreciate you sticking it out and hearing the stories. We're going to process all of the information and really get back to the community in terms of what the next steps are. But we are confident that we are on the right path. And we just ask that you go back to your communities and share what you heard tonight, talk it up, and hopefully the next time we come together, the crowd will be even bigger than it is tonight. So again, on behalf of all of the organizations represented here, and on behalf of, I don't see Pastor Walker and Little Rock AME Zion for hosting us. Thank you again for, give yourselves a big hand for coming out tonight. Thank you so much.